Hey, it's Patricia Murphy. It's Thursday. This is Seattle Now.
You kind of feel like at a certain point it's gonna hit you hard somehow.
This year has been full of grief and loss, but also joy and surprising connections. You've been telling us all about it through KUOW's Voices of the Pandemic series. In a minute, we'll hear some of those voices and explore what a year has taught us. But first, let's get you caught up. Tim Eyman will no longer be allowed to have any financial control over political committees. A judge ruled yesterday that the prolific initiative filer took donor money and spent it on himself. Eyman was also ordered to pay $2.6 million in penalties. The 2017 lawsuit from the state attorney general accused Eyman of soliciting kickbacks, laundering donations, and flouting campaign finance law. State lawmakers have signed off on a $2.2 billion COVID relief bill. It includes big chunks of money to help schools get kids back to the classroom, funding for vaccines and contact tracing, rental assistance for tenants and landlords, and small business grants. There's also money for child care programs, undocumented immigrants, and food assistance. Governor Inslee is expected to sign it next week. And pour another one out, this time for Yonder Cider, the Greenwood garage/walk-up bar. Its owner tried to make the best of the pandemic by selling to-go cans and growler fills, but after repeated complaints from a neighbor that the walk-up was too close to a church and a school, it's shutting down next week. The SeattlePI.com reports that neighbors who love the place are taking it personally. Some have filed their own complaints with the city.
You're out there or driving down 3rd Avenue and it's nothing. It's a dead feeling. Ugh. For the first time in my life, I'm like, I'm actually missing traffic. That sounds weird, huh?
The silver lining to this is that we're spending a lot of time with each other. I flit between anxiety and just sort of really enjoying spending a lot of time with Mom and my brother, Ken.
Even with washing my hands and cleaning the car all the time, it didn't feel like enough to protect my mom.
Because I was isolated, my English started getting worse and worse.
One of the nurses called me and said, "Your mom is really struggling. She can't hear very well, and we're all dressed like astronauts."
There are many days where I descend into tears because I'm not sure what I'm doing and if I'm doing the right thing.
This is Reverend Kelly Brown. She ministers at the Plymouth Church in downtown Seattle.
I felt handicapped and as if someone had cut off bits of myself or bits of me because I didn't feel like I could do what I normally do. I find myself just being quiet and looking at the sky or at a wall or just sort of in this almost catatonic state because I'm constantly worried and constantly sort of waiting and watching and praying to see who's next. So yes, there have been deaths, and yes, there are people who are ill, and it's so crushing to walk with people, to companion people through illness virtually. Because of the grief of losing dear friends and the grief before the grief, the waiting to hear who might have passed over, I light a candle every day. And so when I light the candle and I watch the wax drip, I imagine that it's the tears that are so necessary to get us through this time. There's no need for us to be strong in the sense that we are disconnected from our emotions. This is a time for us to truly be human, to understand that the candle represents our ontological need to burn through this suffering and this time of quarantine. Every day that I light the candle, I feel its heat. I am reminded that that's how it will feel when I'm able to hug friends and family again that I'm missing. And together, all of us are feeling the heat of our flames. And we know that we will be different on the other side of it, but we will be. And that's going to be enough.
Those were just a few of the pandemic stories the KUOW newsroom collected this year. We've heard from frontline healthcare workers, weightlifters who built their own outdoor gym, a family waiting out the pandemic in their remote mountain cabin, and those who had to say goodbye to loved ones over video chat. My colleague Joshua McNichols is one of the reporters who's been doing this work, and he compiled the stories into an hour-long special, up now on KUOW.org. Hi, Joshua. Thanks for being here.
Hey, Trish.
You know, I've heard from friends this year who say they can't cry and they don't know why, and I think in a lot of ways that speaks to the trauma that a lot of us are going through. And Reverend Brown talks about the idea about being intentional about grieving and grief, about honoring it.
Yeah. And she recently lost, I think it was her mother, to COVID, but she's made this intentional choice not to run away from it, but to try to face it. And in doing so, I feel like it's teaching me something about facing grief. I mean, all of us right now are facing some form of this grief, whether it's from COVID or from, the dramatic loss of community we might face from being isolated or even from politics, because we are so divided politically. I mean, the story of our time right now in some ways is about loss of community. I think so much of what we see in the world right now is driven by a response to that grief. On the one hand, you've got people in a stage of denial about the virus and wanting to just resist it. On the other hand, you've got people who are just very sad because they've lost someone close. And I feel like there's a journey for us to go on in encountering that grief face on, as the Reverend Kelly Brown did, and we can learn something from that encounter.
Joshua, so many of us are not at the point where we can do the level of introspection that we need to right now. Not everyone has that capacity because maybe they don't feel safe or they're feeling unsupported, which is why I'm so fascinated with the interview with TJ Green, the chairman of the McCaw Tribal Council. The McCaw Reservation is right on the northwest tip of the Olympic Peninsula, and it's been closed to visitors since the pandemic started. TJ told our colleague John Ryan there's a historical reason the tribe is taking COVID so seriously.
What our ancestors went through when, around 90% of our population was decimated by smallpox in the mid-1800s. That's alive in our oral histories, taught throughout the families. And so, it does, bring back some thoughts of what it must have been like for our ancestors. We certainly know that we're vulnerable, and that the tribal community that we have, and I think all tribal communities in the Northwest are facing the same thing. Our elderly are the ones that carry the knowledge, the wisdom. They carry our songs and our spiritual practices, and they're the glue that holds our cultural identity together. If we were to lose a handful of those people, it would just be devastating. During this time when we're restricting it from visitors, it's certainly been a blessing for our community to reconnect to some of these places that we've given up for that tourism industry. We're certainly thankful and blessed that we have such a beautiful area to call our own. We're fortunate that we're a tribe that was never moved or relocated from its ancestral lands. We've been here, we say from the beginning of time.
Joshua, we talked a little bit about the problems of isolation, but the McCaw are isolated together, and that is a very different thing. And it's interesting that grief is really central to the McCaw tribe's story right now. That memory of grief, of smallpox in their history, brings them closer to the mission that they need to accomplish right now.
Yeah, and it strikes me that there is a connection between stories of grief and stories of community. And the McCaw story actually offers us an example of how to bring these two themes together, because you heard them talking about the elderly in their community being the repository of these memories of the history of smallpox. And their reconnection with their landscape, their reconnection with their community required those elders to be present and to be part of that. There's a recognition of history and grief in their rediscovery of who they are. And I feel like, for myself going forward, like, I feel like I need to make more room in my definition of joy for grief and loss. And, I called the Reverend Kelly Brown yesterday to follow up and sort of see how she's doing. And I bounced this idea off her that this is one of the lessons I can draw through these stories. And this is what she told me.
I don't even try to get rid of grief. I just let grief sit its funky self over there in the corner and drink its tea. And I go about my business. I don't try to run him or her or them out of the door or anything. I just say, grief, you just sit over there and I'll sit over here. Because what I know in the end is that even grief is a teacher. So I just let them sit in the corner and enjoy themselves and hope that they don't smother me or get too close. And it works. It works.
There's a link to the full hour-long Voices of the Pandemic special in our show notes. Give it a listen. And if you want to share your pandemic story about what's happening now in 2021, there's a spot to do that as well. KUOW reporter Joshua McNichols, really good to talk to you. Thank you.
Good to talk to you, too.
Seattle Now is produced by Clare McGrane, Caroline Chamberlain Gomez, and Jason Pagano. Thank you to everyone who shared their stories with us over the past year. In this show, you heard the voices of Jamie Williams, Teresa Tobin, Tom Paulson, Luis Hernandez Vargas, Ilya Zlamanuk, and Bobby Nodell. Matt Jorgensen does our music. Additional music in this episode by Alec Cowan. I'm Patricia Murphy. See you tomorrow.